This video lecture is on Plato's Apology. Now, this, if there is some kind of a chronological order with Plato's dialogues, comes after the Euthyphro. Because in the Euthyphro, Socrates is already on his way to King Archon's court, right, to defend himself against charges. And then this follows that, where he is actually in court defending himself against charges. And this is where we have the famous lines like, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing. The unexamined life is not worth living." And this is where actually there are a lot of, should we say, subtleties within this text that actually foreshadow much of Plato's other dialogues. Now, this story probably leaves someone feeling like something was done wrong to Socrates, that it was unjust what happened to Socrates. And this is what Plato wants you to feel and think. It is set up in such a way that the reader is supposed to think, oh, wow, Socrates, is clearly in the right, and the accusers and the jury in Athens are in the wrong. But it's not that easy. There's a lot more nuance there. And we'll see at the end, actually, that the way in which the dialogue is set up such that you sympathize with Socrates and think, oh, he was right. Yes, he was right. And yet, does that mean he should ignore the injustice, right? What is the implications there of the truth and justice of what one should do in such a setting, and how that relates to then the good life, how that relates to the city? What does that mean about the relationship between philosophy in the abstract and living one's life as Aristotle, famously claimed in the Politics, that man is a political animal. Right? We necessarily are beings which are we're social beings, right? We run into other people, and we have to not think of ourselves as individuals, but always in relation to these other people, and then in relation to truth. Now, Plato's Apology, it should be understood, does not mean Socrates is apologizing for his actions in Athens, but instead, apologia means a defense in a legal proceeding. So this is the defense of Socrates. And there are two main charges of which he is defending himself from. One is the supposed impiety, which is what he was trying to figure out if he could defend himself and show, hey, what I've been doing is actually not impious, and that's why he was talking to Euthyphro. Of course, that didn't work. Euthyphro was not able to explain to Socrates what the essence of piety actually is, so Socrates could then show, look, what I was doing was not, acts of impiety. So you have the religious charge, and then you have a moral charge, which is that Socrates is corrupting the youth. Socrates is making the young people, which are the future of Athens, bad people. Now, Socrates is going to defend himself against these claims. And it should be understood that the reason Socrates is there is because of what he says is his supposed human wisdom that he has, which is why, again, the oracle of Delphi had said that, well, Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates is like, well, that's just ridiculous. So Socrates goes around trying to find wise people, and at first, he finds a politician, a lawyer, a craftsperson. And the thing is about that, in each of those cases, they actually do know something, Socrates says, right? The craftsperson clearly knows how to work their craft, whatever that may be, if they are a carpenter, a sculptor, or whatever, right? They have knowledge about something. The problem, Socrates says, is that they thought they knew more than they did. And this is where, while those people are not wise, Socrates still is not wise, but he is wiser than them because, again, he knows what he doesn't know. And this got him in a lot of trouble because basically he would perform his cross-examination, the Socratic method, with these people where he would, confront them and say, you seem to know what such and such is, the just is, or what piety is, and so on. And he would ask them questions, and then in trying to defend or justify whatever that definition of the just or piety is that they put forward, it would become clear maybe they actually didn't really know what they were talking about. And this, of course, would embarrass them. And the youth would flock to Socrates because, think about it. They're seeing, look at all these older people. They don't know what they're talking about. And you can see how, on the one hand, maybe there's some truth to that they don't know what they're talking about. But there are also political implications to that, which is why maybe the rich and powerful, the elites, aren't going to like it so much when they're being questioned like that. Now, there's this one main accuser known as Melitus. And Socrates actually paraphrases Melitus's accusation, saying, well, Socrates is guilty of wrongdoing in that he busies himself studying things in the sky and below the earth. He makes the worse into the stronger argument, and he teaches these same things to others, right? So he, again, studies things that are supernatural, that are not according to what people in the city of Athens are supposed to occupy themselves with religiously. He basically is committing the straw man fallacy by, when he's talking with other people, making their arguments look worse than they actually are. And then he teaches those bad things to, of course, young people who are young and persuadable, right? They can be kind of molded into these supposed bad people that Socrates is making them. There's a really interesting claim here that Socrates makes. Socrates says that when an accusation such as this is made against him, because these are kind of rumors, right, that disseminate throughout the city, and other people have taken this up, and they start to say, oh, Socrates is this bad person because Socrates is corrupting the youth, and so on. And Socrates says about this, which is part of the problem why he's there and why he's at an unfair advantage, and which is why he says, well, you've already kind of built these certain dispositions about myself, such that Socrates says, I'm already condemned. There's nothing I can do about it. But he goes on anyways to try and make a point. But what he says here is that because of this, when there is no one immediate he can confront about it from his accusers, and these kind of rumors fester and spread, he says all he can do is simply fight with shadows. Now, this idea that all Socrates can do is simply fight with shadows is actually something very important. Because what it means is, one, if you're fighting with shadows, well, you can imagine there's a shadow against the wall. What are you going to, you're going to punch it? You're going to take an axe to it? Are you ever going to hurt the shadow? No. You're going to hurt those things upon which the shadow is being cast, but never the shadow. So Socrates can argue with other people that might be taking up the opinion of people like Melitus and so on. But Socrates is never going to be able to get at Melitus in that way. Secondly, there's something interesting about this because the shadow is, in a way, a representation, a less perfect representation. And there's something to be said about this because, in fact, in the dialogue, Socrates himself ends up perhaps making shadows of people he gets in conversation with. And in fact, Socrates in the dialogues is maybe a shadow of the Socrates that actually existed, a representation. And we're left to wonder, to what extent does that mean then that what is going on in these dialogues is representations being argued about? Because clearly there's something lost, and that the shadow is not the full account of what it's being cast from. And that's going to have an effect then on the truth of any time you deal with an argument, such that in other dialogues, like in the Theaetetus, if Socrates is trying to deal with a claim made by Protagoras, and Socrates has to speak for Protagoras, Socrates can't perfectly capture everything Protagoras is saying. And what does that mean about maybe the inherent pursuit of truth in that way and in conversation with other people? And the third thing is that this simply fighting with shadows, in a way, it foreshadows, if you will, a later dialogue, the Republic, where there is what's known as the allegory of the cave. And what's very interesting is the allegory of the cave is where, along with the divided line in the Republic, and then as well in like the Symposium or the Phaedrus, you get the positing of what's known as the theory of the forms. And the theory of the forms is where the idea is what makes possible the representations, opinions in our world is that they are derivatives of the real thing, the ideal that exists in the abstract. And so when we see examples of justice, right, these are derivatives of the ideal form, which is justice. In the same way that you could say a cup, right, is one example of cupness that exists in the abstract, in the realm of the forms. But the cup itself is not the essence of cupness. It is the form which makes possible then the actual concrete cases of cups. So in the allegory of the cave, the story unfolds like this. Socrates says, suppose there was in this cave a group of prisoners that were set up chained along a wall, their arms and their legs and even their necks, such that they're made to look forward against this wall. And upon this wall, there are shadows being cast by objects that are made possible by this fire behind them, right? And these people are moving these objects, and they even maybe make sounds, such that the people, the prisoners that are looking at the wall, are seeing shadows, and they think this is what those really are, that when they hear those sounds, they identify it with the shadows cast on the wall. And of course, that shadow is not going to give you all the detail of maybe the kind of sculpture, maybe, of like a horse or whatever that's being shown onto the wall, where, of course, there's more complexity in the horse. And so already we have this sense where, of course, you can think like everyday human beings are those prisoners chained up along the wall, and they are taking for real what are really just shadows, what are just maybe opinions, not the truth. But those sculptures also are not the truth, because Socrates says, suppose then one of these prisoners was let free. And they're able to turn around, and maybe that fire is going to be blinding to their eyes a little bit, but they adjust eventually and they see, wait a second, there are more real things, which are these sculptures, which are casting the shadows on the wall. And then Socrates says, suppose they are led out of the cave. As they emerge from the cave, their eyes are kind of being blinded by the sun and the power of the sun. It takes a while, but eventually their eyes adjust. And when they adjust, they begin to see things in the world, actual trees, maybe actual horses, and not just sculptures of horses, which then make the shadows, which are representations of the sculptures of horses, which are representations of real horses. And Socrates says then, eventually they are able to stare at the sun as it really is. And the sun is a representation of the good itself. True being, real being. And its ideality. And it is the sun that makes possible then all the other derivatives. And the problem is, of course, right, we take those shadows on the wall to be the real thing. So when we're dealing with opinions in the world, we take those to be the real things about how the world actually is, what is really real. And through this allegory, Socrates is trying to show, no, actually, the job of the philosopher is to go beyond the shadows and ask what makes possible those shadows and see what are they a derivative of that is the truth. Now, it doesn't simply end this allegory where it's, oh, great bliss, the philosopher comes to know the truth, and then there it is, now the philosopher is enlightened and they are wise. The philosopher heads back into the cave because perhaps maybe it's a duty, right, to free the others as well and to show them, look, you people have maybe been sheep, right, and I'm going to show you the light, the truth. Well, what happens is, of course, notice the person had become adjusted to the bright light of the outside world. And as they go back in the cave, suddenly it's harder to see things because it's really dark and their eyes haven't adjusted. And you can imagine when they go to talk to the other prisoners and they're not able to really identify the shadows on the wall that well because their eyes, have adjusted to the light outside and not the dim light inside the cave. Already those prisoners are going to think, oh, something's happened to you when you went outside. You can't actually see what we all see anymore. And then you can imagine the person who had escaped is trying to tell the prisoners, look, no, the more real things are outside. This isn't real what you've been looking at your whole life. And what happens in the allegory of the cave is, of course, at first they laugh at this person and think he's crazy, they've lost their mind. What eventually happens is, though, they recognize this person as a threat to their way of life. And they eventually kill him. And you can see there's a clear link here between Socrates and his accusers and what is happening where he's on trial. Now, Socrates here, being on trial, is up against what are known as the Sophists. And Sophists were these kind of faux philosophers. They're not real philosophers because a philosopher is someone who is a lover of wisdom, right? They seek out the truth for the sake of the truth and nothing else. Sophists, on the other hand, are only interested in the truth as a means to other ends, whether it be money, fame, reputation, power, or otherwise. And what they do is they actually rely more on rhetorical skills, so persuasion as opposed to logic, which is supposed to be at the core of the philosopher, right? And one problem is Socrates has never charged a fee, right? All those people, all the youth who follow Socrates around, Socrates doesn't charge them money to hear about his discussions on philosophy. And you can imagine those people who do charge fees don't like that there's this person going around not charging fees, right? One, it's kind of stepping on their corner of the market, right? But two, there's a way in which Socrates is claiming to be more noble than the Sophists themselves. And of course, that's not going to go over well with the Sophists. And who he is arguing against, like Melitus, for example, is a Sophist. And so Socrates tries to demonstrate this to the jury, that the Sophist is really, again, just dealing with shadows, trying to just persuade people. Isn't interested in what's casting the shadows on the wall, what's beyond the cave upon which all the common people of Athens dwell. Now, he does this by calling Melitus forward. And he does a little bit of a cross-examination here. Now, Melitus says, when Socrates asks, you say I'm corrupting the youth, well, clearly then there must be someone that improves the youth. Who improves the youth? And Melitus, flattering the jury, says, well, it's the jurymen, Socrates, who improved the youth. Now, by way of questioning, he gets Melitus to say, well, actually, it's not just the jurymen, it's everyone in Athens. They all improve the youth except Socrates. Socrates is the one person who is corrupting the youth. And Socrates is like, okay, very well then. But let me ask you something. Let's take horses, for example. Does everyone improve horses? Or only people that have been specially trained in the knowledge of horse breeders? And Melitus says, well, okay, yes. horse breeders really are the ones that improve horses. And in fact, everyday normal people might actually hurt horses because they don't know all the intricacies of what it takes to breed a horse. And so Socrates says, well, something similar must be the case with people then. And Melitus says, yes. And Socrates says, okay, well, no one would willingly choose to be harmed, right, Melitus? And Melitus says, yes. Right? And this is where you get a really interesting argument here. No one actually chooses to do evil, is something you can derive from this argument. That when someone does something, even if everyone else takes it to be bad or evil, that person doing it really sees it as the good. And what's interesting is, since Melitus has just agreed that no one would willingly choose to be harmed, if Socrates is willingly harming the youth, as Melitus has said he is, that would mean Socrates is knowingly running the risk of being harmed in return by those very youth. So if Socrates is corrupting the youth become bad people, well, they then do bad things to Socrates. So it would not be in Socrates' rational interest then to corrupt the youth. And that would mean Socrates would not be, if he is corrupting the youth, he wouldn't be corrupting the youth intentionally. As Socrates points out, well, Melitus, it seems like you just agreed, I'm not corrupting the youth intentionally. And if that's the case, Socrates says, well, I shouldn't be here in court because according to the laws, if someone is unintentionally corrupting other people, right, then they need proper training to teach them, look, this is what you're doing, and you shouldn't do that. And quickly they move on then, right? So that's dealing with the claim of corrupting the youth. Then he deals with the claim about the religious charge. Melitus claims Socrates does not believe in any gods. And he says, but, he believes in these crazy spirits. And of course, Socrates gets Melitus to say, well, of course, spirits must be of some divine nature, right? They're not natural. So that doesn't make sense. If Socrates doesn't believe in any gods, how could Socrates then not believe in these spirits, Melitus, that you just said I believed in? So again, that also doesn't make sense. Right, so here we have this case where he's brought Melitus forward, confronted him in front of the jury, done the Socratic method, and shown in both ways, look, Melitus's arguments here are incoherent. Now Socrates hopes, but he's not under the illusion, right, that this is going to save himself. He hopes so, but again, right, he was not going to be surprised, of course, because those rumors, right, those whispers of all his accusers, they've been internalized by the people of Athens. And he understands this. He understands the reputation he has garnered in the city of Athens, and he knows they don't like him, which is why he's on trial. But he thinks what he has actually been doing, even though he's been annoying the people of Athens, is something good for the city of Athens. He claims that he is a gadfly for the city of Athens, doing the city a necessary good. That he has been going around people, trying to shake them, right, out of their everyday habits, what they take for granted, and showing them, wait a second, maybe you should be a bit more critical in what you think you know, and admit that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. This is where he famously says, the unexamined life is not worth living. A life where one goes around taking up opinions and beliefs and not really examining them to see if there's a ground really for them. That's not a life worth living. And so Socrates is actually trying to improve the soul of Athens, trying to, by being this annoying person going around and questioning people, in a way wake them up out of their dogmatic slumber, right? In a way similar to apparently what the philosopher Kant said Hume did to him. Socrates says, it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, conversing and testing myself and others. And this is made clear in Plato's dialogues because, again, they take conversational form. And there's a kind of privileging in the dialogues of conversation in philosophical discourse. There's something about that when you engage in a conversation, you're in a way putting yourself on trial, right? And it takes a humble person to do that. One who examines their life. So, philosophy is the pursuit of truth, but it's a pursuit which necessarily takes place among other human beings, right? There's a kind of reciprocal bettering of oneself with the other person, which is why the cross-examination is used always by Socrates. And I think that's something very important to consider, that for Plato here, this argument we get in this dialogue and in others is that philosophy cannot be done alone, sitting in an armchair such as myself, but in conversation with others. Now, Socrates is convicted. He then is put on the spot to try to figure out, well, what should his charge be? He's given the choice, well, Socrates, you could just stop doing philosophy, right? In a way, you'll be fine, right? You could pay some money, you could flee, and you could live outside the city. All those would be fine. Socrates does not really take any of those, so he says, look, all right, fine. My friends offer to pay some money, so I'll accept that. But Socrates says, I won't apologize, and I will not stop doing philosophy. And he says, I am not afraid of what harm you may do to me. Socrates says, you are wrong, sir, if you think that a man who is any good at all should take into account the risk of life or death. He should look to this only in his actions, whether what he does is right or wrong, whether he is acting like a good or a bad man. So we get this argument that when one is in pursuit of the truth, they should not be afraid of the opinions of others. They should only be concerned with whether what they are doing is right or wrong. And they should not be afraid then of the consequences a city might put on them. So we see, right, in the allegory of the cave, when the person goes back in to try and release those people from their chains, there's a risk of death in this. And yet it is a duty of that person to help their fellow human beings. Now Socrates is then convicted, and he is convicted, or he is sentenced, to die. But Socrates says, I'm not afraid of death. And what we get here is at the end of the Apology, we get a metaphysical argument about the soul, right? So how to deal with, we get one argument about how to deal with this sentence, right? Of basically going around trying to pursue the truth, trying to bring the truth into reality, and the metaphysical consequences of this. And then in the Crito, we get an argument about the political consequences of this. So with the metaphysical consequences of this, we get this argument about the soul and whether one should really fear death. And in considering whether or not one should fear death, how they should go about facing death, he speaks about his time as a soldier, and he says, to fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet the absurd thing is men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. Right? Who actually knows for sure what happens when they die? And he says, why should I be worried when I'm pursuing the truth of dying for it? He's like, not one of you on the jury, not one of you of my accusers. You don't know what's going to happen to me. And in fact, he says, I am not pleading for the sanctity of my soul. I am pleading for your soul. And this is where he claims that it's much more difficult, actually, to avoid wickedness than it is death. And so he says, I leave you now, condemned to death by you, but they the people who convicted and sentenced him, they are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. And so he says, it is you who should be concerned with what you're doing to me, not me. Because it is you who might be doing the injustice. Now, consider a bit more closely, right? What are the reasons for fearing death here? There is the hope that death is a blessing. But Socrates says, right, it's certainly one of two things. We don't know which, but it's one of two. On the one hand, either there is no perception of anything, or there is a change of the soul, supposing it exists, from one place to another. Now, if there is no perception of anything, Socrates says, if it is a complete lack of perception, like a dreamless sleep, then death would be a great advantage. For I think that if one had to pick out that night during which a man slept soundly and did not dream, put beside the other nights and days of his life, and then see how many days and nights have been better and more pleasant than that night, not only a private person, but the great king would find them easy to count compared with the other days and nights. If death is like this, if it is like this day, then it is an advantage. For all eternity would then seem to be no more than a single night. So he says, look, if death is just like going to sleep, what do I have to fear about that? Sleep can be joyful. There's no pain in sleep, only when you wake up, perhaps. But in that sleep, there is no pain. And if that's what I'm supposedly I need to fear, then he says that's ridiculous, because no person fears when they go to sleep. Except for other external reasons, but not for the sleep itself. Now, if on the other hand, there's a change of state of the soul, right? Going from one place to another, he says, and what we are told is true, and all who have died are there, right? In this other place the soul would go to. He says, what greater blessing could there be, gentlemen of the jury? If anyone arrives in Hades, will have escaped from those who call themselves jurymen here, and will find those true jurymen who are said to sit in judgment there in Hades. What would one of you give to keep company with Orpheus and Musaeus, Hesiod and Homer? I am willing to die many times if that is true. It would be a wonderful way for me to spend my time. I could spend my time testing and examining people there, as I do here, as to whom among them is wise, and who thinks he is, but is not wise. And so he says, if then it is the case that there is a change of soul from one place to the other, what do I have to fear that in Hades I could just converse and do philosophy with all the dead people there? I could talk to the great poets and other philosophers of the world. I could learn more. I could have these other experiences than in that other place. And perhaps then it would actually be a better experience than the rest of the people who are going to be on earth that have then condemned me to die and have this other experience. So we have these two interesting arguments as to why we should not fear death. Again, one, if it's just like a great sleep. And two, if it's just another kind of life and existence. Now, of course, if we consider the Abrahamic religions, right, specifically Christianity and Islam, well, there can be perhaps a hell and a heaven, and, you should fear hell. But at least in the case here of the Greeks, the afterlife is really kind of just a bleak gray world. Nothing, there's no bliss, but there's no suffering either. It's just existence, right? So in a way, maybe you can make of it what you will. You can be free to do that. Now, again, as he says, the hour to part has come. I to die, you go to live. Which of us goes to the better lot is known to no one except the God. Now, the following dialogue is the Crito. And the Crito takes place when Socrates is waiting for the poison to arrive, of which then he has to drink and is going to kill him. And friends had been visiting, and he's woken up one very early morning by his friend Crito, a young person who had been following him around. And Crito is very sad that Socrates is going to die. Crito shows up and says, Socrates, I'm here for you. And Socrates thinks, oh, is today the day? Is the poison going to arrive? And then so the next day he would die. When the poison arrives, he would drink it. And Crito says, no. But we think the ship is going to arrive today. It's not already here, but it is going to arrive. And he says, but what I've done, though, is I have ensured your escape. I have people, I've paid them off, who will help you escape to somewhere else. Will you please escape with me, Socrates? Because what the people of Athens have done to you is an injustice. The dialogue unfolds then what to do about that when those people have done an injustice to Socrates in pursuit of the truth, like a good philosopher. Now, what happens is, first, Socrates considers different arguments for escape put forward by Crito. The first argument Crito puts forth is that people think one should escape in such circumstances as Socrates, that they would say, as probably you have when you read the Apology, Socrates is right, he was not corrupting the youth, that these are just people who have it out against him and they're trying to hurt him. So Socrates says, that's not a very good argument. That we can't reject arguments stated before that he made in the court just because now a misfortune has befallen him, that he agreed to accept the punishment. And furthermore, he can't simply follow majority opinion. He can't simply say, well, the majority of people would agree that, I should escape because an injustice has been done, so therefore I should listen to the majority of people, right? We know that's a fallacy. Appeal to popularity. But instead he says what one must do is listen to the wise, even if that wise is only a single person who knows what is just and unjust. So simply just because we appeal to the majority and say, look, the majority of people say this is what you should do, they feel for you, Socrates says, that's not a good reason why I should escape. I should instead use logic and pursuit in the truth of what is truly the right thing to do. So Socrates puts forward a second potential argument as to why he should escape. And he says, it would be just to escape when the Athenians haven't acquitted Socrates, right? This is the second argument put forward, that it would be just to escape because they have done an injustice to you, Socrates, so it would be okay then for you to escape because they've done a wrong. Now, first he says, well, consider the fact that it's law, right, that he should be condemned because he went through the process. If people help Socrates escape, they can then be liable for punishment. So Socrates would then end up risking those who help him. And he says that would be an injustice then, because then he would be putting a certain burden on them of which then they would be liable for punishment. And secondly, more to the point, he says one should never do an injustice in return for an injustice. So the famous saying, two wrongs don't make a right. That it would be an injustice according to the city to escape, even if we might say in the grand scheme of things, it was an injustice which was done to Socrates. Now you might not like those arguments. You don't think those are good enough. What Socrates does next then, because Crito keeps pleading with him, he's like, look, it's just not right. You don't have a duty to follow through with this. What happens is a really interesting thing where Socrates ends up talking to, in a way, the city of Athens. He represents the city of Athens. And the city of Athens confronts Socrates and says, Socrates, has not the city provided the infrastructure for the upbringing of your children? And Socrates has to admit, yes, the city has provided that good for me and for my children. And then the city says, well, Socrates, also, isn't there a fundamental inequality between the city-state and the citizen? Isn't it the case that the government of Athens is not simply another human being where if they do something to you, it's okay for you to do it in return to them? Isn't it the case that by the will of the citizens, the city has been put in a place above all the citizens to carry out the laws? such that one single person just can't object to the city, because then that would mean there would be no city-state, because it would have no authority. And Socrates has to admit, yes, that would be the case. Then the city says, well, the laws of the city actually did allow you to leave if you were dissatisfied with it. It is possible, if you did not like these accusations, right, and how things were done in the city, you could have left and gone to live somewhere else. But the city says, by staying within the city of Athens, you have agreed to obey its laws. And it says, by disobeying, though, if you were to flee and not accept your punishment, a threefold injustice would be committed. One, you would be disobeying the city just as a child does to its parents. Two, you would be disobeying the city as an entity one is indebted to for raising them. So in the first case, there's a kind of power structure there. Two, right, in the second case, there's a debt that one has to the city for the care and the infrastructure they make possible for your life and your flourishing. And three, after all this, then, it's simply just you have been disobeying the city because you have the chance to persuade the city that what they've been doing is wrong. Socrates took that chance in court and he lost. After all three of these cases, then, it would seem it would be actually unjust for Socrates then to flee and not accept his punishment. And Crito is very sad about this, but admits, there's nothing else I can say to you, Socrates. This is what you want to do. You want to accept your punishment, even though we all are going to cry and we're going to miss you, and we think this is a wrong that has been done to you. So be it. Now, I think there are two takeaways from this. The first takeaway is that the truth matters above all else. In philosophy, the truth must prevail over simple matters of feelings and sentiments, right? Thinking that you've been done wrong by it. It must prevail over reputation and power. And we get a bunch of quotes that justify this. We get where Socrates says, virtue and justice are man's most valuable possessions, even more valuable than his own life. Socrates says, don't put a higher value on children, on life, or anything else than on what is just. That matters above all else. Additionally, Socrates says, it's not from wealth that virtue comes, but from virtue comes money and all the other things that are good for human beings, both in private and public life. That in pursuit of the truth, if you really care about the truth, you would not care about whether or not it makes you money or famous. We get, again, the quote we had already looked at in the Apology. A worse man cannot harm a better man. That idea that Socrates is being harmed is simply just a construct. Because the truth is never harmed. And we get the argument that when someone believes they are acting in the truth, they shouldn't be afraid of the consequences. And this is actually very similar to arguments you get in dissent movements of civil disobedience of people like Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and so on, where there's this idea that when you peacefully, civilly disobey, you accept the consequences of what the state may do to you, even if you think the state is acting unjustly. And in a way, the foundation for those arguments that all three of those people I just mentioned utilized and argued for, in a way we can see a certain lineage hearkening back to then Socrates and his accepting of his punishment, in a way being a martyr for the truth. Now, some people think that the argument put forward here in the Crito is similar to what you see in the social contract theory put forward by philosophers like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and so on. I don't think it's quite that because the rationale is a bit different. But this is where I think you get the second takeaway. It's a bit similar. That there is an inextricable link then between the truth and how one ought to live. That in pursuing philosophy, one does not simply just pursue the truth for the sake of the truth. They do. But that pursuit is linked to the human being and their relation as a social animal, their relation to the polis, to the city, to their obligations as a citizen, as a parent, as a brother, as a friend, and so on. And their obligation then to the good, that the truth and the good are inextricably linked together. And that is why, in Socrates' pursuit of the truth, as we saw in the allegory of the cave, one does not simply just pursue the truth without free of consequences. The consequences may not be just, but for good or for worse, they're going to be there. I think there's a very interesting discussion question that comes out of this. And it's just quite simply, do you agree that Socrates should have accepted his punishment based on everything you know from these two dialogues? And what would you do if you were in Socrates' shoes?